All right, it seems like there's sort of a natural decline in volume happening, so we'll get started. Welcome to community-led, or strengthening community-led adaptation. Before we dive into the program, this is a potentially big topic and it's a little different from the other sessions. I wanted to make you all engage, and I apologize. But just want to get a sense of who's in the room. And so I was just going to ask, if you work in academia, can you raise your hand? Ooh, okay. That's a good chunk. If we're going to switch to government, if you're in local government, raise your hand. Couple. Awesome. State. Wicked. Fed. International. Okay. Private sector. Okay. And then if you're in a community-based organization or nonprofit type space. All right. Cool, thank you. And then if you're willing, if you are totally new to adaptation, which is totally fine, can you raise your hand? All right, so we'll do like a little adaptation 101. And then if like this is your bread and butter, you do it every single day, can you raise your hand? Yeah. All right, and then thank you. That's really, really helpful. So this panel has a lot of buzzwords in it, strengthening community-led adaptation. But I think fundamentally, I want this panel to be about hard conversations. So how do we decide what and who to protect in the face of more frequent disasters and climate change impacts? When do we choose to stand our ground and protect in place against rising seas or catastrophic wildfire? When do we talk about retreat or even full-scale relocation? And more importantly, how do we structure those conversations in a way that makes people feel safe, that values their lived experiences? How do we finance and manage these unprecedented projects? And what role do advocates, policymakers, and the private sector play in promoting meaningful, sustainable, and equitable adaptation solutions? So we're going to solve all of that in the next hour, and then we're going to do it. No big deal. I want to tell you a couple things before I introduce you to our extraordinary panel. Adaptation is deeply intersectional. So even for the folks in the room who did not raise their hands when they say, we don't really do adaptation work, I think you might be doing adaptation work. Because even if we stop emitting greenhouse gases tomorrow, we're still going to be grappling with the effects of warming and its resulting impacts. And whether we like it or not, we are currently experiencing the effects of climate change right now. So I'm going to, a couple scary statistics just to get us in the mood. Flooding alone in the United States costs between 180 and 500 billion with a B dollars a year. And that feels like monopoly money to me. So by comparison, that's about more than half of what we spend on public schools in the United States every year. The First Street Foundation, which is a wonderful nonprofit that provides a lot of data on hazards and risk in the United States, they found that today, not 30 years from now, but today, 1 in 4 pieces of critical infrastructure in the United States faces substantial risk of becoming inoperable due to flooding. So think about wastewater treatment plants, electricity infrastructure, fire and police stations, hospitals, airports, that kind of thing. And we know that now, nearly half of all homes in the United States are at severe or extreme risk from at least one form of environmental disaster. So in this session, we're going to dig into the nitty-gritty of how to grapple with these risks and hopefully design meaningful community-based solutions, and also how not to design community-based solutions. And this means grappling with the inherent inequities of climate change impacts. So we know disaster risk in the U.S. is often concentrated within vulnerable populations. For example, flood risk is strongly correlated with household income, meaning the lower your household income, the more likely you are to be vulnerable to flooding. We'll talk about more than floods, but we know a lot about floods right now. I also wanted to make sure that we highlight the difference between the risk of facing a disaster and the impact that that disaster has on a household. So even if 2 homes are impacted by a disaster, if one home doesn't have flood insurance, or one home thinks they have insurance but they aren't prepared to take on the additional costs, or someone in that home has a disability which means they're dependent on an electricity-powered mobility device. All of these things affect how quickly someone can bounce back from a disaster. And it also means the way that we design policies and whether or not those policies can meet people where they are and satisfy the particular needs that they have can have a huge impact, not just on saving lives, but also livelihoods and lifeways. We also know that proactive adaptation can be incredibly cost-effective. For example, a recent report found every dollar invested in flood protection saves up to $318 in damages, so it's a decent return. And of course, they can help prevent job loss and increase employment growth in hazard-prone areas. So there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot of problems to solve. It's also very, very complicated, which is why I have a really incredible panel here to help us solve all of that. So we'll do some brief intros and then get right into it. Also, hi, I'm Hannah Pearls. I work here. How's it going? I work at something called the Environmental Energy Law Program here at Harvard Law School. We have folks from our team up here in the corner. And we are a legal think tank based here at Harvard Law School. We are also joined by Anna Weber to my left. She is a senior policy analyst at the Natural Resources Defense Council, where she focuses on the current and future effects of flooding, sea level rise, and other climate-driven hazards, and ensuring adaptation policies benefit those on the front lines of climate change. Prior to joining NRDC in 2018, she spent 10 years at the Cadmus Group, where she supported EPA contracts related to water infrastructure and environmental health. And she grew up in South Central Pennsylvania in the Susquehanna watershed. Their bios are a lot longer. You can check them out. I omitted their degrees because they're all very smart and qualified. People in disaster world are snarky. That's just how we roll. Deborah Butler, again to the left. Dr. Butler is the executive director of the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, whose work focuses on adaptation, restorative, and resilience capabilities of indigenous and place-based communities, with a particular focus on climate displacement, migration, and relocation on the Gulf Coast. Among her many degrees, she also brings lived expertise as a native of the Gulf Coast and a survivor of Hurricane Katrina and the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And finally, Alex Gallo. She is a special advisor to the US EPA, specializing in implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. And among her many roles, she helped launch the Environmental and Climate Justice Community Change Grants, which will provide $2.2 billion, again billion with a B, in grants and technical assistance in disadvantaged communities. Alex previously served as Senior Specialist on Detail to the Federal Emergency Management Agency and at the California Strategic Growth Council, Office of the Governor. And Alex grew up in California's Central Coast and is a first-generation college graduate. So thank you all so much for joining us. And Anna, I'm going to start with you and ask you to give us a quick rundown of what adaptation means. Can you just do Adaptation 101? Thanks so much.
All right, everyone, get out your textbooks. Thanks, Hannah. So great to be here, especially with this fantastic panel. So we thought it might be helpful for everyone to just sort of start at the very beginning and basically, like Hannah said, do Adaptation 101. What does this actually mean? What is this concept that people talk about or often, in fact, don't talk about? There's a lot of different definitions of climate adaptation. I actually really like EPA's definition, which is very simple. It's just taking action to prepare for and adjust to both current and projected impacts of climate change. So there's a few things in there that I want to point to. One is that we are both preparing for, in a future-looking way, and adjusting to, in a sort of current, ongoing way, both the current impacts that we are experiencing today and the projected impacts that we will be experiencing in the future. The UN has a slightly more technical sounding definition, which also has aspects that I like because they call out adjustments in ecological, social, or economic systems, again, in response to current or projected impacts. But basically, I think what all of this boils down to is whether we're thinking about impacts that we are experiencing today or that we expect to in the future, all of this is about how climate change is showing up in our real lives, interacting with all of the real systems and institutions that govern how we live, and sort of how climate change is affecting all of us. Of course, some more than others. But climate change is not something that we're thinking about for the future, right? I think there's been a real evolution in the environmental advocacy community, speaking here as someone who's employed by a big green NGO. The conversation over the past few decades until very recently has mostly been adaptation? We don't talk about adaptation. Adaptation means we have failed. If we act now, we can prevent the worst impacts of climate change. Raise your hand if you've ever heard that, probably like in an email from my employer asking you to donate money. Act now and we can prevent the worst impacts of climate change. Well, sure. If we are talking about my hypothetical white middle class grandchildren, maybe we can prevent the worst impacts of climate change on their lives. we're holding on at this point. But how can you say that to someone who has lost a family member to a disaster, someone who can no longer afford their home insurance, someone who can't get a mortgage, someone who has lost their home, someone who is going to have to find another job because they can no longer work in the heat in their farm field or their warehouse. These are already people who are experiencing the worst impacts of climate change. They're experiencing it today. And as Hannah pointed out, even if we magically waved a wand and got rid of all greenhouse gas emissions on the planet from today going forward, we still have locked in impacts of climate change. So it's a little bit of my adaptation soapbox. Adaptation is not a gateway drug to convincing people it's important to talk about climate action. Adaptation is climate action. It's important in and of itself. I do want to just cover a couple of additional buzzwords because they might come up a little bit. A buzzword that comes up a lot is resilience. Resilience is an interesting word. I think it really suggests a sort of bouncing back to the status quo. And there are some cases in which bouncing back to the status quo is a good thing that we need to be doing. You probably want your apartment building or your water treatment plant to be resilient, right? You probably want your infrastructure to be resilient because if something happens, you want it to bounce back to the way it was yesterday. A lot of communities, however, and residents of areas that are affected by these current and ongoing impacts of climate change would prefer that we do not use the word resilient to describe them or their communities. To paraphrase Tracy Washington from New Orleans, if you call somebody resilient, that just means you can do more to them, right? And so thinking about adaptation, resilience perhaps can be a part of adaptation, but adaptation is bigger. Another buzzword that comes up a lot is mitigation. I'm bringing this up because there's a couple things here. One, mitigation often means greenhouse gas emissions mitigation, climate change mitigation, preventing, quote unquote, the worst effects of climate change. Often when you're talking to adaptation people, we use mitigation to mean hazard mitigation. And so you might hear us say mitigation and it might not be greenhouse gas mitigation. It might be like making structural changes to something to mitigate risk in a more broader sense. Finally, we're going to talk a little bit about, for lack of a better word, mobility, human mobility, ecosystem mobility. That's the broadest term that I can think of to come up with this concept. There's a lot of nuance to the words that we use, and this in and of itself is adapting. The language that we use to talk about these concepts is adapting, but concepts like managed retreat, relocation, migration, all have a lot of really important connotations and history that come with them, and they can mean different things to different people. So that might come up through the course of our conversation. Finally, one thing I just want to say is that adaptation often, especially for a US audience, conjures up like structural interventions. We're going to build a wall to keep the tide out of the New York City harbor. We're going to elevate somebody's home so that it doesn't get inundated by floodwaters. But adaptation can't just be something that happens in the built environment. Adaptation has to happen through all of our social, economic, legal systems. Anything that we have invented as a society, we've invented with this sort of assumption of a stable environment. Our legal system assumes that we can rely on the environment to behave as it has in the past. Our housing system relies on that. Even our medical system relies on that. And so when we talk about adaptation, we're not just talking about adapting our infrastructure or our homes, but we're also talking about adapting our institutions and sort of the fundamental systems that we rely on as people to sort of get along in society. So I want to just sort of broaden everybody's minds a little bit and kind of think about the bigger picture of adaptation. Thanks.
That's actually a perfect transition because Deborah, you've done a lot of thinking around what are the internal organizational shifts that have to happen in order for an entity to engage in adaptation work effectively. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit to that and some of the key differences you see between mitigation work in the greenhouse gas context and adaptation work.
Thank you, Anna, for that introduction. But I want to build on what Anna has said and ask you just for a moment, how many quantum physicists are in the Okay, well, actually,
They're all at another
we're
meeting.
all.
They actually are.
We'll pretend that we are just for a second, and I want you to just sort of think about this. Climate change, the Earth is a very old system, and what time is for very old systems and for the Earth is millions and millions and millions and millions of years. We can't even say how many million years. And so I want you to think about climate change as being the trajectory of Earth systems, because quantum physics, as we know, is the relationship between time and movement, moving across this arc, and we're riding the system, okay? So adaptation is a behavioral change that we have to make in all of our systems to be able to ride this arc. We can't change it, but we have to figure out the best way to move through it. And the Earth system is a very old system, but we don't have that kind of time. We really don't have that kind of time. So our behavioral changes in our organizations and the way we imagine this whole thing has to be from the inside out, it has to be behavioral, and it has to be now. Because we don't have a chance to backstop or say, wait a minute, that's not going to continue and we've got plenty of time. We don't. Mitigation is completely different. Mitigation is an intervention in that trajectory, but it impacts us, not the trajectory. We can fracture the way we behave, we can fracture our systems. We can fracture the way we think about it, but Earth systems will continue to move through time, just the way they always have, and just the way they always will. So we have to decide what's important at the time and what kind of mix, what that equation will look like as we build up this movement, this journey that we have through quantum space, right? And so if I make a quick example and you say prisons, for example, what is mitigation in prison? It's when you take somebody who's offended you and take them out of the system, put them in jail, make them behave, and hope that when they come out, they'll do something differently. I think the prison system will inform us over and over again that doesn't work. What is adaptation? Adaptation is when you take perhaps that very same person before they go to prison, improve their health outcomes, improve their education, improve their housing, improve their opportunities for work, improve their opportunities to have participation in civil discourse, in governance, and perhaps doing that, you won't have to mitigate later. So this is the relationship that we have with each other, and this is the relationship between adaptation as a construct and mitigation as a construct, and that works across the board. What was the original question? I'm sorry. Governance.
Sure.
Okay. Governance. Governance is very complex. Governance is not government. So when we look at introducing these constructs into governance, we're looking at a very complex system. We're looking at the way we make up our laws. We're looking at economics. We're looking at all of the social functions that generate this thing, this power thing that controls our universe. And so when we look at governance, for example, in the city of Boston, you're looking at trade unions. You're looking at construction, you're looking at commercial entities, you're looking at educational institutions like Harvard. You're looking at all of these things that sort of shift the gears, the man behind the curtain that makes all these things work. And all of those are power functions. And so when we talk about governance, those are the things that we need to interrogate and investigate if we really want to make a difference in the way we live our lives and build society going forward. So that's the transition from what adaptation is, how we do that within our organizations, and how we do that within our social systems, and how we do that within our government systems, and the difference between that and how we mitigate government, which is very, very different.
speaking of government, Alex, I'm going to shift to you, and I think one piece Deborah's picked up on is we have to really rethink how our existing structures operate and whether or not those existing structures facilitate the adaptation we're trying to achieve. And to get really specific about it, the Biden administration has, for the first time, I think, in the U.S.'s history, invested a really significant chunk of change in pre-disaster preparedness and adaptation. And yet, we have a federal system that was built up to respond to rare environmental events. So we're kind of trying to pull a 180 without going beyond sort of the existing government structures that exist. And one thing I want to flag for folks that's also distinct between mitigation and adaptation in the federal context is we have federal preemption around pollution rules, meaning the federal government in general controls the standards that we set on air pollution, including greenhouse gases. Whereas in the adaptation context, local government controls where we build things. State government oversees insurance. The feds don't touch insurance except in flood context. And so the feds have this really constrained role. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about your experience within the Biden administration, where you see the federal government's role and how it's changing, and some of the sort of opportunities and limitations.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you for my panelists for setting the stage for what we're dealing with today. I came to the federal government at an extremely unique time period. I previously, as Hannah mentioned, worked in the state of California, and so from the state perspective, the state of California is huge, and California has significant funding, not always, but historically for climate investments. That was kind of my area of focus there. In the federal government, as Hannah mentioned, there has been significant investments over the last few years through agencies even beyond EPA, at FEMA as well, focused on hazard mitigation. But now we are seeing billions of dollars for climate investments, and more specifically, environmental justice. And so now we're looking at communities that have never before seen climate investments, have very seldom seen environmental investments, and are preparing for absorbing $2 billion at a minimum of an influx into their communities and grappling with how to deal with that. So I had the opportunity to come on board to EPA and help to stand up a lot of those programs, but just to put into perspective, when it comes to environmental justice specifically, all of the communities nearly who are suffering the disproportionate impacts of pollution burden, significant impacts in terms of their access to air quality, clean water. They're going to be the first ones hit by climate change. And they also are the few that have really had zero climate investments or other investments, basic infrastructure, clean water, clean lands. And so we've really been focused on building out those programs. So specifically, we at EPA had just a few $100 million to support planning and project development in communities with environmental justice concerns across the country. And then President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act into law, and since then we've had $3 billion allocated. We've been able to select 11 grant makers, which essentially are organizations that will be making sub-grants to communities to implement different projects, project development and planning primarily. We also have awarded 16 to 17 Thriving Community Technical Assistance Centers. And so these are really focused on building up the capacity of organizations to be able to help organizations and communities adapt to climate change and build their capacity in a variety of different ways. But at the same time that the federal government is trying to help build capacity across the country, specifically for communities with environmental justice concerns, those who have been marginalized more than anyone in this country, at the same time we have very small timelines for these very same communities to implement infrastructure. And so that is a very difficult challenge that we have ahead of us. But one thing that I really love about what the Biden administration has been doing, especially as it relates to our environmental and climate justice investments, is there's an increased awareness that local solutions, we need local solutions to local challenges. And that's very different from what I had previously experienced in engaging with the federal government, where traditionally large amounts of funding are provided to states, and then states kind of are able to make their determinations in terms of who get what pots of funding, where, and what those will be used for. But here at EPA in the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights, this funding, in particular, $2 billion, will go directly to community-based nonprofit organizations, local governments, institutions of higher education, and tribal governments, and you're making it a requirement that these projects are driven by the community and that they truly are localized. So that's I would say a big shift that's happening in the federal government, is really acknowledging and helping ensure that we're able to implement local solutions to local challenges. And in addition to that, we have been talking a lot about what adaptation means and how that is reflected in grant funding opportunities. If anyone here has ever tried to work on a federal grant, I'm sure you felt that you're trying to get a really exciting project and then chip away at it until it makes sense for a federal opportunity, and it really takes away both the character of the project and also the effectiveness of the community's ability to adapt to climate change because of how these grants have been written. And so for us, we've gone through extensive engagement processes to make sure that we can develop something holistic that really reflects the lives of people on the ground, and that is incredibly flexible. In rolling out this funding opportunity, I can truly say that we've never seen anything like this before in federal government. In one funding opportunity between $10 to $20 million, communities can do workforce development. They can develop a resilience hub. They can plant trees to reduce extreme heat. They can also reduce pollution in their communities. And so as we're thinking about investments in communities with environmental justice concerns, in this unique new implementation authority we now have, we want to make sure it can be as holistic as possible. And we're not only focused on the traditional taking away pollution from communities that have pollution there because of government decision making, but we're also bringing significant investment into those communities in a holistic way, in a way that works with the ecosystem that Dr. Butler had mentioned.
I want to follow up on one very specific thing. So a good number of government folks in the room. Can you talk about some of the really specific changes that y'all made to the grant application process to try to make them more accessible? Because I do think that there's so many choices that go into how someone can qualify for this money that can inadvertently exclude folks from accessing grants, and the Fed is a monster. So how do you check all your boxes while trying to make that money more accessible?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, especially because this was the first time we had ever had an opportunity to truly build a national program for environmental justice. We wanted to make sure that we were taking all of the right approaches in developing this program, because once you, what I've seen in the federal government, at any level really, once you build something and get it out there, it's really, really difficult to take steps backwards, remove language, and to then embed equity when there was never equity in a process to begin with. And so when I came on board, absolutely, that was, we wanted to do a process that was the exact opposite of that. So essentially before even putting pen to paper, we told our colleagues in US EPA that we cannot build an equitable program if we do not have an equitable process. And that is something that we had to really reiterate over and over again, and I think it's so important because what we have today with the community change grants is something unlike we've ever seen before. We worked really closely with our National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, the NEJAC, and specifically co-developed a community change grants framework, which is now implemented as part of this federal open funding opportunity. And as part of that, we have heard a couple of things. The first is something I've already touched on, but is the fact that we need to have multidisciplinary approaches to investments in communities. And while grants are just that, grants, they really set the future in terms of what communities can and should look like. And I think sometimes that gets lost in that connection between grants and community development and what that lifelong process looks like. And so we were able to focus on eight climate action strategies and 4 pollution reduction strategies in total in one funding opportunity. And as one of those climate strategies, workforce development. Recognizing a just transition and how that is all connected in the cycle of environmental justice. As I mentioned too, because there has not been significant investment in capacity building in communities across the country, in particular communities with environmental justice concerns, we knew that getting a funding opportunity out and having a full supply within 3 months was not going to get funding to the communities who need it most. And so one of the most innovative things that we've done is instill a rolling application process where our notice of funding opportunity is open for 12 months and we accept applications on a rolling basis. And this I think has been really game-changing. And also allows people to look at competitions a little bit differently, where they can actually learn from each other in this process. Whereas historically, it can be really difficult for organizations to compete against each other for funding. But because we've extended this timeline, it's just shifted, I think, the general culture around how organizations are working together and against each other in some ways too to access these dollars. And because we've been able to expand these timelines, we're able to allow people to resubmit. So actually getting direct feedback in person or virtually from EPA on what they need to do to resubmit their applications, I think is another huge benefit because as I'm sure many of you know, a lot of times when you submit your application, it feels like it's going into a black box and you just hear back and that's that, and there's really there's nowhere to go from there. The last thing I wanted to highlight is that we are actually hearing directly from the applicants. So we've included an oral presentation process as a part of our program. One of the biggest things that we heard from environmental justice advocates was that the frustration that higher capacity organizations are able to hire grant writers and therefore the federal government is really not able to see through what this application, who it's supposed to support directly and how folks are working together truly to create change in their community. So we're able to actually interview various people who have said they're going to be a part of this grant application, and as a result, we've allocated much more weight to different perspectives rather than just what is written to EPA. If I can just highlight our target investment areas because I'm very excited about this, and this is truly historic. Coming from our stakeholders, again, as part of this process, we've actually set funding aside for different geographics. So we have said tribal nations, a minimum of $300 million. We have this goal. We've also made set-asides for tribes in Alaska, U.S. territories, the southern border, and finally, disadvantaged unincorporated communities. I wanted to make sure that we're able to highlight with this platform because when it comes to representation and governance, these communities have little governance, if little to no representation, and so we've actually said we're setting aside funding for these communities to access these dollars.
Really appreciate you walking through all of that. And I think it's really fascinating that in the adaptation space, we really see the federal government in this grant-making role. And I want to shift to what happens on the recipient side, because there's ways for then the grant recipient to implement this well and really make full use of those funds, and there's ways for it to go less well. And I think highlighting both of those would be really helpful. So maybe we'll start with the less well. And Deborah, I'll start with you. Not that Deborah's responsible for this, she has experience. If you could talk a bit about some of your experience in the Gulf South and trying to name some of the components where you see community-led adaptation breaking down and the costs of that breakdown.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. And unfortunately, it is the norm rather than the exception in the Gulf Coast. And perhaps a poster child for that is Ile-de-Jean-Charles, which is in, between the areas between Plaquemine and Terrebonne Parish in South Louisiana. And they're a very unique community. First of all, for those of you who don't know the Gulf was settled about 150 years before New England. So it's a very, very old space. And it was settled even before then, about 30,000 years by Mississippian people who came down the Mississippi River from the middle of the country and settled in that area. And so we have a very unique historical sense of place. And Southerners are very proud of that. And so they talk about it a lot. But there's stories about it. But Ile-de-Jean-Charles is one of the communities that represents all of those things. They are an indigenous community, mostly Chickasaw, Biloxi, but they are there because of the Trail of Tears, and they're a combination of tribes that were trying to get away from Andrew Jackson's Trail of Tears back in the early 1800s. And so they fled the areas throughout the South and ended up in southern Louisiana because it was a safe space and very, very hard to get to. And so they've been there for probably, 300 years, and they are just a consolidation of cultures and races and ethnicities, and they've been very happy in their place because they are very attuned to the place, and so they're ecologically attuned, cosmologically attuned to the place, and that's where they are. And so when oil was discovered in the Gulf of Mexico, all of that began to change. And so the community decided that they were not going to make their migration because they realized this about 25 years ago that things were changing and that the community would have to move off bayou. And so they did a very heartfelt and very inclusive decision to move as a community north of the bayou. They made an application to HUD. Researchers came down, scientists came down, they measured, and then they decided, okay, we think you have a really good case to move as a community, and that was one of the requirements of their application. And so they were awarded $42 million from the Department of Urban Development to move as a community. However, the money was sifted and directed to the state of Louisiana in a block grant because the Ile-de-Jean-Charles community is not federally recognized. That money has been with the state of Louisiana for 20 years. Ile-de-Jean-Charles has not moved as a community. They have been thwarted in every possible way that you can imagine. The community has been forced, of course, because of inundation, to have to move because salt water is coming into the bayou and is killing and overrunning all of the fields and farmland that they had. All of their trees are dying. Their bayous are clogged up. The oil canals that were built to transport pipelines have been abandoned. So they're living basically in a wasteland that was once absolute paradise. Cypress Creek's been shot down. Further east, the mangroves that actually protected the coast are gone because of dredging. And so Ile-de-Jean-Charles is sitting there, but they are still fighting. They are still fighting the federal government. They're still fighting the state of Louisiana, who has squandered $42 million of their hard-earned work. And so in that sense, we have just the worst possible thing that could go wrong. for a community who has who has done everything that they were asked to do, every single thing that they've been asked to do. And so, but they're still fighting. They just sued the state of Louisiana because for them on this trajectory, that is the only path out. That is the only solution. That is the only way that they can provide and consider the next 7 generations of their people and to move forward. But that's happening over and over and over again in communities everywhere. It's happening on the East Coast, it's happening on Cape Cod, it's happening in Southeast, the Southern Carolinas. It's happening wherever you have place-based people who have been trying to negotiate these bills for a very long time, but have not had the support that Alexandra was talking about to be able to negotiate the systems. And a lot of it has been because of the federal government's inability to, because the Indian Voting Act and all of the civil rights issues, the injustice issues that have followed those communities have prevented them from taking a full participation in government and in governance. And so it's not just the inability of a community to get the work done, but it's been sort of a systematic overthrow of tribal sovereignty in those cases and civil rights issues and others. And so what we are hoping moving forward is that that will change, but it will take all of us to make that change because it's important that we understand that what happens to Idle Jean Charles is going to happen everywhere, eventually, if communities like this don't move forward.
So we are going to move to potential success stories. But I wanted to name a couple things. One is, and this is why I love talking to Deborah, is anytime we start to talk about community adaptation, or adaptation in general, we get a history lesson. And I think that is the right way to go, because if you were to strip a community of its history and then say, now we're going to fix all the problems that we see in the present day, which will then ensure a safe future, that of course is not true.
Well, a lot of the research has been done horizontally, and a lot of the interventions have been done horizontally. So you have researchers and you have money, and they come into a place and say, we're going to fix this place. Well, that place is more than that place. That place has a history that's vertical as well. And so if you look at the community, if you look at the space, if you look at what's happened there for the last 300 years, all of those things are very important to whatever intervention that you have. It's like looking at the rings on a tree. How old is a tree? It's not just the bark, it's all of those many, many layers that have absorbed history, that have absorbed stories, that have actual chronic, how am I going to say this?
Chronological.
Thank you very much. Time over space. So you look at the rings in a tree, you know how old the tree is, that will tell you when there was a forest fire, when there was some sort of viral infection, because all of those things are history embedded in that tree. The same is true of the soil and the land. And so when you go to a place, it's not just, oh, we're just going to do maps and do GIS stuff and all of that. For example, if you go out into the Gulf of Mexico 50 miles and you do bathymetry studies, you will find out that there are middens and mounds and villages 50 miles out in the Gulf. So what does that tell you about coastal inundation and sea level rise? It's an old story. It's an old story. And so what we hope that you will take away from this is that there are successes. We have a history of successes as human beings. We're not doing very well right now, but we can.
Can you briefly mention the National Academies of Science study as well?
Yes. The National Academies of Sciences did a 2-year study on what community-driven or community-led adaptation might look like, particularly climate change based, but not only climate change, but for any other reasons. It could be wildfires on the West Coast. It could be the complete deforestation of land in the Arctic and what's happening there. It could be any number of things. And what we found is that you cannot do a consistent, you cannot do a deep study, you cannot understand what community-led relocation is until you look at the place. You start from the place. And also you have to consider where you're going and what impact that has on receiving communities, where they are, what their capacity is. And so it is a very long process, but we also found that there are capabilities in communities still. There's strength in communities still, and we have to support that in order to come out with just outcomes.
And if folks wanted to find that study, what would they Google?
National Academies of Sciences, community-driven relocation.
I think it's a great transition because Anna, you've looked at these questions in a very specific context and pulled out sort of lessons learned and best practices for one, how do you do community-driven adaptation processes, and why does that matter? Like, is that actually a good thing that produces good outcomes? So I was hoping you could talk a bit about your bias community and practice work and what you learned.
Yeah, so one thing is that you might be surprised after everything that Deborah just told you that there are some people who consider the Ile-de-Jean-Charles relocation a success. In fact, it is sometimes held up as the only example of a successful community relocation that the U.S. federal government has ever funded. And I've been in meetings for my job is to go to meetings, I go to a lot of meetings. I have in some of those meetings, in multiple of those meetings, extremely well-meaning people who have all of the best intentions point to Ile-de-Jean-Charles as a success. And I think that points to, like, what do we define as a success? Who gets to define what that success is? If we are just looking at, some people moved from point A to point B, that's a success. Sure. But how can we be defining success? And I think this sort of points to this larger question that you brought up, Hannah, is if we're trying to think about, like, what is a best practice, right? Like, what is a lesson that we need to be taking to heart? Who gets to define what that success is? When do they define what that success is? Because if something happens in your community, you may have a very different opinion about it today versus in 30 years. And who is keeping track of whether these are successes or not based on that definition? In addition to capacity for getting grants and implementing grants, we also need capacity for evaluation and capacity especially for telling people what you went through. And that last piece is something that we've been very focused on in the work that I've been doing, which is related to an extremely specific little corner of climate-related mobility, which is the home buyout. Who's heard of a home buyout program? Anybody? Yeah. So this is not a new idea. Actually, right before this, I was meeting up with my aunt who lives here in Boston, who I haven't seen in a while. She was talking about some friends of hers that live in coastal Massachusetts, and she's like, oh, they really want to move because they're tired of flooding, but they don't want to pass the buck to another family. They don't want people to go through what they've been through. And I'm like, oh, I've heard that story before. So the idea is in those cases where somebody does in fact want to relocate at an individual household level, what if instead of passing the buck to an unsuspecting family, because in most states we don't have very good residential flood disclosure requirements, so there's no requirement that you tell the person who's buying your house anything about what it's been through. What if instead you could sell your home to a public body who is then bound by a deed restriction to take the property down, to demolish the structure and preserve the land as open space in perpetuity. So now you are not putting anyone else in harm's way, and you are hypothetically, or at least ideally, using the land for some sort of public benefit, whether that's a park or stormwater retention or green infrastructure, something like that. That is the idea on paper, and in fact, the U.S. federal government has been funding these projects since the late 80s, early 90s. The first time this was done in a big way was after the Mississippi River flood in 1993. The unfortunate part of this is that we've basically been doing the same buyout since 1993 for a lot of different reasons. Buyouts are actually pointed to in the sociological literature as an example of failure of policy learning and essentially reinventing the wheel and not working towards any kind of success under any definitions. So really quickly, what we're doing in our project is basically trying to close that, in fact, adaptation gap and adapt this program, which again is one very tiny little corner of climate adaptation. It's a tool, and like any tool can be used for various purposes and to various outcomes. We're basically bringing together people who have professional experience in doing home buyouts, as well as people who have lived experience or community experience doing home buyouts, putting them in rooms together and getting them to talk to each other. Which it turns out is actually a pretty innovative idea because nobody has ever done this at this scale before. And one of the things that we hear over and over again, and this is not limited to buyouts, but is something that we hear a lot, is how isolating this is, not just for the people who are going through a home buyout, but also for the professionals who are trying to implement these projects in a way that's responsive to community needs. They are typically, being funded by agencies like FEMA, which, unlike the things Alex was describing, does not typically have community as its focus, but rather financial impacts and property values. So my plug here is, if anyone knows anyone, maybe in your government or in your community or in your organization, who has experience, lived or learned experience with home buyouts, please come talk to me, because we're trying to build our community of practice. And we did a little test run a couple of years ago, and we want to launch this in a big way, where we have people who are driving their experience back into the process, because that is the only way that we can discover what success is to actually adapt these programs themselves, and have this sort of space for innovation. To tie this back to some of the other concepts that we've been hearing about, it's not like I'm sitting here saying home buyouts are great. They're not. I think pretty much everyone can agree on that. The best home buyout is one that you never have to do in the first place, but they're basically the only financial and sort of policy tool that we have at this point to sort of get us along the way to something more holistic of, human mobility in the face of climate change. And so we're going to have to be making these projects better and scaling them up in a big way. And I think that when we're thinking about this concept of mobility and what success is in an adaptation concept, how do you do this work sometimes when there is no success, right? In a lot of these cases, talking to communities, success would require a time machine, frankly, right? Success would require a time machine and a dismantling of structural racism and a complete and utter overhaul of all of our social and political and government systems. That is probably not going to happen, especially the time machine part, maybe. I mean, there's very smart people here in Cambridge that perhaps the quantum physicists are working on that right now, wherever they are. The other parts of it seem even less likely. But still, despite all of that, how can we be working to something better that takes into account the fact that, nobody is going to wake up one day and move to Duluth because of climate change. Maybe some people will, but that's kind of the narrative about the Gulf Coast is climate relocation is one day the entire Gulf Coast is going to wake up and move to Duluth. And that's the farthest thing from actual human behavior that we could possibly say. Nobody is in this position because it's it sounds like a cool thing to be a climate migrant. It's because there's decades, if not generations and centuries of actions of people and institutions that have brought a community to this place where they have to be making these hard choices. And the thing that we can do at this point is make sure that whatever that next choice is a real choice. That whatever happens next, the community actually has agency in, and if the community wants to move somewhere else, that they have the agency to do that. If they want to adapt in place, that they have the agency to pursue those options too. And so it's not like, how can we all be working towards a specific solution, but how can we make sure that all of the options available to communities are in fact real options that are real choices and not just the last and least worst thing because the other option is doing nothing. Sorry, I said we would end with optimism.
One thing, when you and I have talked before that I think is optimistic, you mentioned it's an isolating experience, and I think one thing you all have touched on is, while there is historical precedent for human mobility in the face of hazards, with the present sort of institutional friction that we have and the financial friction posed by climate change, one thing that is deeply relevant is offering support. And I think with the community practice, one thing you've seen is how transformative it is for someone to have access to someone else who's already gone through the process. And so one thing NRDC is doing, and spoiler, Deborah, Anna, and I are part of something called the Climigration Network. That's how we know each other.
And you should be too. CLIMigration Network, sorry about that. But the purpose being that when you have access to someone who has the lived experience that you lack, and that you're able to engage in peer-to-peer learning with that person, and once you can build out a network of folks who have gone through this process, that is in and of itself transformative. So that's one thing. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it is a very, very big deal. And the other thing you've mentioned, if I can put words in your mouth, is that what we're moving towards is a system of sustained hazards. Whereas before, we thought, we could build a program up and then put it away after every single hazard. And so one piece that you all have found is we need programs, not projects. We need a program that handles buyouts and managed retreat, if that is what in fact you want, where you have staff that are permanent and can build institutional memory and can build sustained relationships. And I think that too has been transformative. If I can put words in your mouth. Is that fair? That sounds good to me.
Wicked. All right. We have a minute left. Any questions? Yes, and you are.
This has been fabulous, and I would love to end maybe with some optimism on the agency point, which I would talk about in terms of self-determination.
Sure.
What I'm curious for any one of you, what is one actionable thing that we can do to move us from, if I can quote the folks at Movement Strategy Center, from community engagement to ownership? What is one thing that can move us more towards that place of self-determination and agency?
I think one of the first things is to appreciate everyone else's place and where they are in their histories and their legacies and their cultures, and that it's just as important to them as your place is to you. And there are examples of where this has worked, but we have to decide that that's what we want to do, and that the standard for home ownership may not be a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house with a lawn in the suburbs. There are different places that can be home, and there are both culturally and physically, and I think that there are plenty of examples all over the world where that works, and we might ought to try that at least a little bit. Yeah.
I think to add to what you just said, in addition to recognizing and embracing everyone else's place and history, also your own, I find I identify very strongly with the place where I grew up, despite the fact that my parents aren't from there. But I go to meetings that are people talking about relocation and the concept of place attachment and climate adaptation, academic sounding titles with academic people. And once I was at one of these meetings, and the academic who was sitting next to me, who is a massively accomplished researcher in this space, says, academics don't have place attachment. how can we work on this? Because their entire career is often built around the ability to pick up and move, you know, for your job or for your spouse's job at a moment's notice. Which I think is just so funny because everybody has place attachment. Everybody has something. Everybody has a story. There's since I'm already on this, that there's a silly cute little poem that I like by there's an American poet named Bob Haycock, and he writes about like what it's like to be from where he's from. And the conclusion of one of these poems goes, "Let us all be from somewhere, let us tell each other everything we can," which I think is just like so genuine and is something that all of us can do.
I think to go off of that, and I think we can all relate to this, whether you're helping support community-driven relocation or helping a community who's staying in place and wants to improve their conditions on the ground, is that this work is incredibly challenging, and because that's not a breakthrough thought, but because there's so many practitioners in the room, state government, academia, local government, really diverse perspectives, what I've seen is folks want to shy away from conflict, and I think that's critical. Conflict is actually a good thing, and it's really the only way I've ever seen people able to move forward. So if you are trying to work with a different community organization, working with local government, any sort of entity, even CEOs who have to work with industry because they just have to, just recognizing that and going back to what Anna's saying, we all have our place in this. We can all relate on a human level, really outlining, okay, when we have a dispute, what's going to be the process to sorting that out. I think all of those things, really thinking through the practical steps to embracing conflict, because we're an ecosystem and we all really need each other to create change and to adapt to our changing climate.